Sure, I'll be very brief. But thank you, Melan, just to frame uh, this community and sure, I'll be very brief. But thank you, Melan, just to frame uh, this community and the work that we're about. Associated Parishes is a community of priests and practitioners and lay leaders and theologians who are trying to help the church to connect liturgy and mission and to equip congregations so that liturgy helps all the baptized to live into the fullness of their calling and be really formed by their experience of worship. And if you go to our website, and I'll put the link in the chat bar, you can learn more about all the resources that we have, including a recently revised guide to creating and having a good worship committee in your parish, and lots of other brochures. A set of principles called Pillar and Cloud that can be a great resource for helping people in your congregation think about what grounds your worship practice, and most importantly, gatherings like this, where we bring people together to learn and to resource one another. So welcome on behalf of APLM, and I hope you'll stick around with us.
Thanks a lot. So just to say, this webinar has been made possible by a grant from the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, their Vital Worship project, with support from the Lilly Endowment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Leah Schade, who is our resource person for this evening. And just a short story, I originally thought of asking Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, who led a wonderful workshop when I was principal of my small theological college on preaching and ecology. And Margaret recommended her colleague, Leah. And I hope we might just hear from Leah how this encounter came about. But I was delighted to meet Leah, who was willing to be here for us this evening. She's an associate professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky, an ordained minister in the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and with a background in congregational ministry. She earned her MDiv and PhD from the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. And one of her publications, I won't name them all, was co-edited with Margaret, a collection of essays from a cross-section of faith leaders and activists, offering their spiritual wisdom and energy for facing the difficult days ahead. I was very helped by just an initial conversation with Leah about the project that we're involved in and what we're encountering as people of faith in a time of climate crisis. It was my hope that we would come together with our partner congregations in groups of 2 or 3, so that this would not just be a focus on clergy who preach, but on the communities of reflection that they are part of. We're a more diverse group with not quite the configuration that I expected, but we'll cope with who we are. Leah uses the project of preaching good news in the face of environmental devastation and the climate crisis, and knows that this can feel overwhelming to pastors and congregations. And so she's introduced a 3-fold approach for preaching that addresses environmental justice issues, with an eye to interpreting the Bible through a green lens. I won't say more than that. I'm just going to invite Leah to introduce herself and to launch us into this evening's project, this evening's webinar. Thank you so much, Leah, for being with us. And thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you, Milan. And just a real thrill to be with all of you and having this important conversation. And just a word about my partnership with Margaret. So the way she and I met was, back in, I think, 2018, I have a blog called EcoPreacher, and I launched a contest. inviting preachers to send their best ecological sermons. And I was going to give a little prize to the winner. And Margaret submitted, and hers was the best. It was fantastic. So I got in touch with her, and we talked, and we started realizing that we knew some of the same people, and we have a lot of the same interests, and we were commiserating that it feels, this topic is very heavy. The ecological crisis is not getting better; it's getting worse, and how are we dealing with what I call the dark night of the green soul? And we sort of, wouldn't it be great if we could get people from different faith traditions to share about how they're processing this and how they're sustaining themselves? And, well, I know this person and I know this person. Pretty soon we realized, we could do this, couldn't we? So we pitched Roman and Littlefield. They loved the idea. We got 21 authors to contribute, and I'll talk a little bit more about the book later on, but we did this project together, and here's the really funny thing. We have never met in person, ever. We were supposed to meet at a conference in 2020, which got shut down because of COVID, so we have never actually met. I don't even know how tall she is. But one of these days, we are going to meet and hug, and it's going to be wonderful. In the meantime, we get to see each other in these virtual spaces, and it is wonderful to see you here, Margaret. So thank you for the recommendation for being here. All right, so let me do a screen share here, because I have all kinds of fun stuff to talk with you about this evening. All right. Let me get rid of this and minimize this. All right, so we're going to talk tonight about preaching with an ecological lens. I'm going to give you some strategies and tactics for green sermons, or at least ecologically minded sermons. As Maylon mentioned, I teach at Lexington Theological Seminary. We are primarily an online seminary. Our students only come to us for intensives in January and June. Everything else is either through synchronous or asynchronous courses. We are based in the Disciples of Christ tradition, where we have students across the denominational spectrum, and they knew I was Lutheran when they hired me, so they got what they got. Got a bunch of books down there, but the primary ones that I'm going to be drawing on are those that really speak to the intersection of preaching and ecological issues. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the research that others and myself have conducted about the state of green preaching today. So first, a little background. There's an organization called EcoAmerica, and they have been surveying Americans about their level of climate concern. And they have found that 78% of Americans are more concerned about climate change. And this was back in 2021. I think the number is pretty much the same 2 years later. So that's a lot of people that are definitely concerned about the climate crisis. So it's important for preachers to speak about this, to preach about it, to have conversations pastorally, educationally, and homiletically. Why is that? Well, in 2014, two organizations, the Public Religion Research Institute and the American Academy of Religion, conducted a study on religion values and climate change. Also, in 2022, so just last year, the Pew Research Center conducted their survey. And here's what they found. Really interesting that both surveys found similar things. More than 6 in 10 Americans who report hearing about climate change from their clergy, at least occasionally, were very or somewhat concerned about the climate crisis, compared with 39% who went to churches where it was never talked about. Okay? So what does that tell us? It tells us that people are listening. Now, it may not necessarily be the case that, well, my pastor preached about this and now I'm going to go be a climate activist. It may be that they're already predisposed to caring about this, and so when they hear from the pulpit, it's resonating for them. Or it may be that, okay, my pastor thinks it's important, is framing it biblically and theologically. Maybe this is something I need to take into consideration too. But in any case, there is a correlation between preaching and attention and care about environmental issues. Now, my team has been conducting research about preaching and social issues since 2017. We've done 3 survey waves to ascertain how are preachers dealing with certain topics. And I'm going to highlight for you just today on environmental issues. So we've had a lot of people from a lot of different denominations. I'm just going to focus on mainline Protestant today because that's the tradition that we're in. So you can see in 2017, we had close to 1,000 respondents. In 2021, about 1,600. And in 2023, almost 1,000. So we had a good amount of mainline Protestant preachers responding to this. And here's what I want you to see. So in 2017, on the left, we asked, did you talk about this issue, about environmental issues? Only a quarter of them said that they did. That jumped to 46% in 2021. And this year, that number was 78%. That is a huge increase. Now, just a caveat here. This was an anonymous survey, and it was done through, snowball sampling and convenience sampling and snowball. So we don't know if the same people were answering every time, but because of our numbers, we can see this trend. We definitely see that preachers are talking about this more than they used to. And that is very, very encouraging. Let me pause there for a minute and see if you have any questions about this research. Does it resonate with your own experience? Does it surprise you? Just let me hear from you about what when you see that kind of data, what that brings up for you.
It's
go ahead, Susan.
It's encouraging and motivating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'll just quickly say,
go ahead, Margaret.
I'll just quickly say that I was preached into jail. The first time I was arrested for civil disobedience was after hearing a strong sermon. So I feel like I'm living witness to the power of a good sermon.
Wow. Wow. That's beautiful.
I think
it also.
else?
Go ahead, Philip.
I think it's material for those who live in purple to red areas to recognize that it's you don't have to be afraid of it. People are thinking about it rather than having to, you know what I mean? I mean, I think it gives you permission.
Yeah, it's not politicized quite to the same degree it was even 6 years ago. And there's a good reason for that. It's no longer in the future. It's happening right now. There's nobody who is not touched by this. Nobody. So it's no longer, I mean, of course, there's always going to be that small percentage that, denies that it's either human caused or that it's part of and says it's part of natural cycles, or it's actually good for the environment that we have climate change. There's always going to be that percentage. But there are more and more people who are saying, hey, I'm not seeing the same kinds of animals and birds that I used to see. Our growing season has changed. There are climate catastrophes that are happening all the time. I mean, it is just a complete upheaval. So people are looking for biblical and theological ways to think about this. All right, good. So let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so let me share with you some basic principles of green preaching that I draw from one source and then some of my own research. So Norman Hobble edited readings from the perspective of Earth, looking at how to read and interpret Scripture through an ecological lens. And he proposed 6 principles. One is the principle of intrinsic worth, which means that the Earth, the universe, all of its components have intrinsic worth and value as compared to having either commodified or utilitarian value. Like It's good because God says it's good, not because of what we can sell it for. Another principle is that of interconnectedness, that the earth is a community of interconnected living things, mutually dependent on each other for life and survival. We're not just in our own little, like when we talk about humans and nature, that's actually a false dichotomy. We are nature. We are part of nature. Nature is part of us. The principle of voice. And we see this in scripture, that earth is a subject, not just an object, capable of raising its voice in celebration and against injustice. So when you see the Psalms talking about that the trees clap their hands, and when Jesus says, if you try to silence my disciples, even the stones themselves will cry out. So it's not just about animating or trying to personify earth. Like earth is literally a witness in scripture. When there's in the ancient Hebrew scriptures where we see a sort of a court scene where God is against humanity, God calls on nature as a witness to what humanity has done. So earth has agency. So we also see principle of purpose, that the universe, earth, all its components are part of a cosmic design, which each piece has its place in the overall goal of that design. What is that goal? The flourishing, the diversity, just the immense abundance of life. Also, the principle of mutual custodianship, that earth is a balanced and a diverse domain, that we take care of each other. It's not that humans are at the top of this pyramid and we rule over everything. We're part of the web. And it is our responsibility to ensure that all of the other parts of the web can survive and flourish. And then finally, the principle of resistance, that the earth doesn't just suffer from human injustices, but actively resists in the struggle for justice. Okay, so those are hobbles. Now, I added my own principles based on an ecofeminist hermeneutic for preaching. And this, you can find this in my book, Creation Crisis Preaching, Ecology, Theology, and the Pulpit. Now, what do I mean by ecofeminism? In case you haven't heard of this term before, ecofeminists assert that there is a fundamental connection between the oppression of earth and the oppression of women and those most vulnerable. So that means you can't separate out ecological issues from the way they affect the most vulnerable. Like you have to look at the hierarchical, patriarchal domination systems and how that is imposing oppression on earth and women and those most vulnerable. And then ecological issues are directly tied to justice for women, those who have been impoverished, people of color, all marginalized, vulnerable groups. They go hand in hand. So that's what ecofeminism asserts. What I did was to take that ecofeminist hermeneutic and apply it for preaching with 4 basic principles. First, focusing on earth orientation rather than a hermeneutic of anthro and androcentrism. Anthropocentrism is focusing just on the human perspective. Androcentrism is focusing on specifically the male human perspective. Now, of course, most of scripture is written from the male human perspective. So we often have to find the minority report within scripture in order to unearth this. So we have to read scripture through a green lens to ascertain how texts can be oppressive or liberating to women, children, those most vulnerable, and the earth community. We're also thinking about proclamation for both the human and the other than human community of earth. So sort of in the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, who preached to the elements of creation and saw earth as kin. So we're going to analyze the impact and power of certain texts and how that's going to affect both the human community of faith and how we're embedded in particular places and within the earth itself. A third principle is what I call a hermeneutic of remembrance. So we're trying to recover biblical traditions so that we can view the biblical story from an ecofeminist perspective. So in my book, Creation Crisis Preaching, I have a 3-part sermon series where I preach one sermon as the person of Earth and seeing the story of creation from Earth's perspective, not just from humanity's perspective. Then I do a sermon where I preach as the character of water in the story of the woman at the well. What does that story look like from water's perspective? And I actually tell the creation story from water's perspective. But then I also talk about the woman at the well where her well has been fracked. And what is water's perspective there? So those are just two examples of how that might look. So we're moving beyond the presumption of subordination of Earth and Earth's inhabitants, particularly women and those most vulnerable, lifting them up, giving them voice. And then finally, creative actualization. So we're telling stories from Earth's and women's perspectives. We're going to reformulate the narratives so that we see a discipleship of equals among the human and other than human communities. All right, so let me pause there. I just threw a whole bunch of ideas, maybe even new ideas at you. Let me see if you have questions at this point. Go ahead, Philip.
Because I'm going to respond to this in a minute. The embeddedness, you went by a little quick on that, and I was working on the other material. Can you do just a little bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I offer in Creation Crisis Preaching is an exercise called Who is My Neighbor? And it's a mapping exercise where you can do this on your own or with your youth group or with your council, where you do certain activities to get a sense of who and what is around me that is part of this congregation beyond the walls of the church. So what are the trees that are on our property? What are the watersheds? In what ways do we see healthcare workers noticing the impacts of environmental things? Who are the people who are working closely with Earth, the beekeepers and those who fish and those who farm? So we think about our place, and we think about the local issues that are impacting our congregation and how we can speak to that as people of faith. So that being embedded in place is extremely important for this kind of work. I saw Melan and then Penny.
So I'm interested in just an example of the principle of resistance, that Earth and its components not only suffer, but actively resist. Can you just give an image or an example?
Yeah. So the third part of that sermon series, I preached as ruach, which is the Hebrew word for air, spirit. And I tell the story of what it was like to breathe over creation and help to bring life to creation. I talk about what it was like to breathe through Jesus's preaching, but also what it was like to be driven out of Jesus's body at the crucifixion. And then I move into the day of Pentecost, where I move over the disciples and catch fire. And in the modern day, then I tell about what it is like to feel myself choked by pollution, and that the very breath of life is being threatened, and what it is like to breathe through those who are protesting and singing songs of resistance, and how they are joining their voices as one through the children and through the communities of faith. Like that is how the Spirit is manifesting that resistance to the oppression of climate change and the fossil fuel industry. So I do this as Ruach in sort of a poetic monologue kind of way, but that's just one example of that.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. Penny.
Yeah, I just want to say that Anne and I were both part of the preaching schedule for September. Our Creation Tide celebration started with wilderness, and then we had water or rivers, and then I did forests, and Anne did land, and we happened to be in a forest, and so we started our liturgy literally outside in the forest, and the sense of being embraced by those trees in that way that we did, and tying it to Creation Tide, we then had this and Ruth knows this well because we talked about it in our consultation. We did a communal confession about how we had failed to honor our impact on the climate and our behavior and how we live, and also to resolve to do differently. I think it's also clear to note that we noticed that we are really part of an agricultural community in West Marin, and that we have failed to connect with the agricultural community around us. And so that's one of the things that we're hoping to do. We've written a small grant application to be able to have a presence at our local farmers market and really connect with people who are the growers. And also, of course, there's a large number of people, Hispanic people particularly, who are working some of these agricultural interests. So it's really inspired by the conference in Minnesota, where we had this wonderful presentation from a Good Courage Farm that really alerted us to the fact how much inside we are and how we are not connected with the very environment that we're in. So I just want to share that.
I love that, Penny. One of my students took some of these principles, and in her congregation, they decided to go to farmers markets and start a gleaning program where the farmers, like when they have leftover produce, they don't have to take it back. So the church would take that and give it away to in lower income communities. And it was beautiful because the farmers felt like their food was not going to waste. They were making a connection to the church, that they were making a connection to the community. Like there was this beautiful bridge building going on there. And so you talking about that triggered that thought for me. Go ahead, Elizabeth. And then we're going to go back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, everybody. So, Leah, I am a longtime member of the International Network of Biblical Storytellers. And so you're preaching to the choir member here. But one of the ways in which we've been taught to internalize and then tell by heart a biblical story. I don't know if I'm freezing. Am I freezing, everybody?
No, we can hear you.
Okay,
we can see you.
So, for example, the story at the wedding of Cana, you tell that biblical story, or you learn it, or you interpret it, say, by the clay pot that's on the side of the road, right? Nice. So you're imagining the feet and the kerfuffle and just all the commotion. Is that what you're saying? So, like, you know, if one of the lections were, you know, the creation story, or Jesus breathing his last, or the water in the well, yeah. Do you take the traditional NRSV interpretation, translation, and then do you just retell the story? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
As a sermon.
Yes.
That's amazing.
As a monologue, and the sermons are in the book. All three of them are in there, and I preached them like all over the place. And I do it with, like, you know, scarves, and there's audience participation, and it's really cool. And the other thing is, I have a colleague who once preached the story of Job for 4 weeks and took a different character each time. Wow. So one time took the sailor's perspective, one time took Ninevite's perspective. And you know what he did the last Sunday? He preached from the worm's perspective at the end of the story. He literally got on the floor and wriggled around, and then wriggled his way up to the pulpit, and like it was so good. And he like wrestled with, I don't want to have to kill this bush. What is my purpose here? What's going on? It was really, really fantastic. So yes, thinking about the other than human parts of the story, and what are they seeing? You know, when we think about Jesus saying, look at the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. Okay, if they're his teaching partners, because that's what he's saying here, let's listen to them. What are they saying to us? What do they say to the original hearers? What are they saying to us now? So yes, excellent, excellent. All right, this is so much fun. Let's go back here. And I want to, okay. So what I want to do now is I want to just give you some other ideas for strategies for doing this kind of work. And I call this rooting. So we want to make the case that creation care is part of our responsibility as Christians. So we need to do this by establishing strong biblical and scriptural foundations. All you got to do is look at Genesis 1 and 2. So our efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions and clean up pollution, all of this is helping to preserve the earth, which God called good. Like it's right there at the beginning. There's a great book that I recommend. It's actually a 2-part series called Eco Bible by a colleague of mine, Rabbi Yonatan Nerel. And they take a Jewish ecological lens and look at the first 5 books of the Bible. Others are the Green Bible, which has all of the words about creation in green print. You've heard of like the red letter Bible. Well, all the stuff of Jesus has been red. Well, this is the Green Bible, right? Then there's also different websites. I know the Episcopal Church has its own website, Lutherans Restoring Creation website, Sustainable Preaching website. There's lots and lots of resources out here. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I also will give a plug again for my book with Margaret that we co-edited. We have essays from Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, gay, straight, young, old, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Unitarian, and a post-Christian punk activist. Like, there's so many great perspectives in here. And it has study questions, so you can do this with a small group or with an interfaith group. Margaret has written some amazing spiritual practices. There's 7 sections of the book, so there's 7 sets of questions, 7 sets of spiritual practices, and there's lots of sermon themes and illustrations in this book. So want to commend that to you as well. All right, now I want to give you you all got hopefully the PDF with the EcoPreacher 1, 2, 3. And I want to walk you through how you can do this in a really practical way with an upcoming text for Advent. So with the EcoPreacher 1, 2, 3, I developed this with Rabbi Yonatan Nerel. And it starts out with an eco-exegesis. So we're going to read the text through that green lens. Then we come up with 1 eco-idea, 2 eco-questions that you could think about in context of your community, and 3 possible eco-actions. Okay? So we're going to look at 2 texts for December 17th. So you got plenty of time to do some work on this. We're going to plant some seeds here. I'm going to walk with you through the Isaiah text. And then when you break into small groups, you're going to look at the John text. And we're going to come back together. I'm going to show you where you might go with this, with a sermon. Okay, so can I have a volunteer to read just the first 2 verses of Isaiah 61, 1 to 2? Just first one to unmute, start talking.
The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn.
Great, thank you for that. All right, so let's think about this term, the year of the Lord's favor. That refers to the Jubilee year. And this is like the Sabbath of Sabbaths. So every 7th year, there's supposed to be a period of rest. And every 49th year, so the 7 times 7, 49, this is when all debts are supposed to be released. All property that has been taken is supposed to be restored. And they're supposed to see some economic rebalancing here. As they say in Eco Bible, the commandment of the sabbatical year enables a return to the ideal relationship between humankind and creation. So how does that happen? Well, the year of the Lord's favor is about giving the land rest. So during that period of time, you're not supposed to do any planting, pruning, plowing, harvesting. Whatever grows, nobody has ownership of it. It's just free for all. Everybody just gets to share in the abundance. And this gives a break. This breaks this cycle of poverty, and it's meant to restore both land and people. So we think about this text from that perspective of giving land and people Sabbath, rest, the year of the Lord's favor. So they say the mandated abstinence from attempting to control the land and own its produce frees us from the enslavement of the constant pursuit of material goods and wealth and the idolatrous illusion that they make up our existence, which they don't. God's grace and love and abundance make up our existence. Okay, so we're thinking about what restoration looks like in terms of both people and earth. We're thinking about the ruins being rebuilt and the cities repaired. Those who have robbed and engaged in economic predation, they face consequences and accountability. And those who have suffered from that predatory behavior will not only experience relief, but also will rejoice in abundance. So that's what we're seeing in this text. We're seeing earth itself celebrating this restoration with new growth. Okay, so before we take our break, or I should take our break, before we go into small groups, I want to give time for Philip to give his response, and then we're going to do some small group with the John text. So go ahead, Philip.
Well, I just am thrilled. It's just terrific. Being part of, I'm just going to put another plug in for Associated Parishes, because it's just, you get all these different things that go into renewing and turning you into something else in terms of leadership in a community of faith. So, which is why I've been able to maintain something fresh and new all the time after 35 years. So, you know, it's because you go and access and are exposed to resources like this. So it's just fantastic. So thank you for that. And in our neck of the woods, in my particular context, where I plow the field and scatter, we just had a Reformed pastor removed after 4 months because he was a young guy, really the best pastor they'll probably ever, they're going to crash and burn now. They removed him because he was too ecologically sensitive. And so it boggles us. We try to surround him and support him with care and love. It's that kind of thing is still happening. The virtue and the value of this, and perhaps he went about it with a bludgeon or an axe or to grind it, perhaps, you know, I'm not sure what else was there, but the value of what I'm hearing is sort of an authentic and organic connection, so that people aren't thinking, oh God, he's talking about the climate crisis again, right? And that was one of the principles with Associated Parishes, where we were talking about with each other, talking about the challenge of having a season of creation sort of plucked out and plunked down, rather than every Sunday is about the created order. And it needs to be organic and tied into the whole. And so I think when it's overlaid and applied, it just becomes another axe for a person to grind, as opposed to something authentic and woven into the community. So I too am deeply impressed about the worm that God appointed. It has got nothing to do with the whale, and you could even do a sermon about the comparative strength of both the whale and the worm. So it really is just a terrific passage, and has nothing to do with Jonah getting swallowed up by the whale, but the worm is the most important character in this thing. It's just fabulous. So I'm all about that. And I think the process of looking at and giving permission to have a green lens, and having to always wrestle with the first narrative of creation with take dominion and subdue it, and trying to deal with different kind of language and recognize that the sacred text is needs to be managed. And we've been having good luck with the Indigenous Peoples New Testament for the past couple of years. And that I'm not sure that that actually is enough and is not as effective as being more deliberate with the Renew Bible. So I think I don't want to take up too much more time, except I'm enthusiastic about it and I'm really am appreciative. And also, finally, and more importantly, the most important thing I'd say is it's hope-based. And there's a lot of disempowerment with people who have decided to say, well, it's just me. I have nothing I can do to do anything about it. And it's all too late anyway. So I think eco-preaching and organizing around these three actions that you've got for us to do next will be fantastic. So why don't we go ahead and I've got to figure out how to break us into small groups. And
and I think you can just do that. I don't think you need to handpick, just divide people into, I would say, groups of 5, 4 or 5. And let's take like 15 minutes for that. And I'm going to, I did put the text into the chat and I'm going to put it in again here. And I'm also going to put some questions when you get into your small groups. I'll put them there now, but you can discuss these. You don't have to get through all of them. You can just pick 1 or 2. And
Jay's comma ended up being really fruitful for me.
Well, I did the comma and she did the great sermon after the comma.
don't most great sermons happen because of a comma? I love that. I love that. That is great. Thank you, group 1. How about group 2? Go ahead, Cynthia.
No, I was in the other group.
Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think it might have been in our group. And I'll tell you, the moment of insight for me was when we were talking about, by what authority was John preaching?
Mm.
The answer he gave was water.
Mm. Mm.
Anyway, that was just an aha moment for me, that water itself was the base of the authority for what John was preaching.
That's beautiful. I have never thought about that before. And when you think about that, it was water that was present at the very beginning of the great Tehom, the great depths. And out of that, all creation arose. And it, out of that, the Ruach speaks. And that's beautiful. I love that. But you could definitely do a sermon on that. Excellent. All right. And group 3, which I think there were just 3 of you in that group, but I don't remember the names.
Ruth, do you want to go for it?
I was going to tell you to go.
Oh. We had the best short conversation of all time. And thoughts were spinning quickly. I guess we were really hung on question 1, and Leah, you may have to just jog my actual
Yeah.
So it was the darkness, the death dealing darkness, and God's affirming
Life affirming forces of God's reign.
Life affirming forces. Okay. And then so we went to Isaiah as our jump off place, Isaiah 45:7, where the prophet says, I, the Lord, create weal and make woe. I make weal, create woe. I bring light and bring darkness. I, the Lord, do all these things. So we identified that darkness is part of God's creation, that there is a kind of necessary darkness, but that there is a darkness that is created by our blindness, that is not necessarily of God. And we spun around darkness for a while. And it was interesting because Ruth graciously read us the translation from the First Nations edition. And I quoted my professor from Indigenous Studies years ago, who said, you cannot see the light unless you are in the dark. So that sort of brought about an understanding of the kind of darkness that God created and needs us to be a part of, but that there's a distinction. And I don't know, Ruth, what am I missing here? Because we really talked fast, and somehow it even got into, one guy in our group said, that it's like we're shrouded with darkness. Like the times we are living in with war and climate crisis are so dark, but we have an active part in being light. And then we spun into the parable of the wedding banquet, and that our action in the world is putting on that garment to say, we are people of God, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think it's important.
Fast.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between darkness as part of creation and darkness as a symbol for evil, which I think we have to be really careful about given the racial connotations of that. So I want to be really sensitive to that. At the same time, the way in which darkness is, the personification of evil in the text, it's there. I mean, it is there, and it's not meant racially, but it's there. There's a great book by Barbara Brown Taylor called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, especially as a Lenten or Advent book. Just fantastic, where she flips the script on darkness being a bad thing. So, yeah, I'm totally with you on that. But excellent, excellent stuff. All right, we only have a few minutes left, so let me go back and just share with you some final thoughts. And we're going to do that here. And get rid of this. Okay, so the eco idea is a succinct statement that tells us who God is or what God does in relation to creation and how we should respond as people of faith. And we might say that God gives us a vision of Jubilee restoration so that we can repair and rebuild both human communities and Earth's ecosystems that have suffered from oppression and captivity. So that's one way we might, give sort of a foundational idea for this sermon. The eco questions are what we can ask to help a congregation draw out the implications of the eco exegesis and the eco idea. So one might be, during this season of frenetic acquisition and consumerism in the lead up to the commercialized holiday of Christmas, how can we make space for quietness, contemplation, and reconnection with God's creation? And I can go all kinds of different directions depending on your context. Another question might be, where are the places in our community that are in need of rubble clearing for God's straight path? Has a climate disaster turned a habitable place to ruin? Has gun violence shattered the peace of families, schools, and neighborhoods? What are ways that people from our congregation can help clear the debris, provide some breathing space, and offer respite and restoration? So those are some things that you might be wrestling with, talking with your folks with as you're preparing for this sermon. And then the eco actions are ways that a congregation might respond to the eco idea and the eco questions. And maybe one of these will have some salience for your ministry context. So one comes straight out of Eco Bible. Ask your congregation to give back 10% of its land to the commons, devoted to viable water harvesting measures and scalable land management practices to restore balance in our landscapes. So there's one idea. Another one is encourage your community leaders to plant fruit trees and gardens in public places so that everyone can enjoy the produce for free. This is a Jubilee action. Like, just put it out there so that those with homes, without homes, with economic means, without, like it's just there. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Just plant them. And then finally, one thing you might consider is to rebalance the economic scales by paying off school lunch debts for students' families in your local school district. But not just that, join lobbying efforts to make all school lunches free for students. Give Jubilee right here and right now so that everyone can enjoy the bounty of earth and our children can survive and thrive. So those are all things. I encourage you to sign up for EcoPreacher. This comes out every month. We do, we look at one of the texts in the lectionary during one of the Sundays in a month. And this is free. I will put the link into the chat, but I would love to have you, look at the website and sign up to get those monthly EcoPreacher resources. And we have about 4 minutes left for questions. It went so fast this evening. But I'd love to hear any. Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
It's not a question. I just want to say that not only has this been an exciting presentation, so thank you so much. Exciting, informative, and a good mix of giving us an overview and practical for preachers. But I think this is important for all of us, because if we're going to be faithful to the gospel, we have to be apologists for creation. And you said earlier, or somebody did, about how even in red states now, that's people are going into the climate issue, but there's still far too many people that still see creation as the backdrop and almost welcome what's happening because it means Jesus is coming back sooner and making the new creation. And so I want to thank you for that too, because I think it helps give us a language to help our people become apologists for the gospel.
That's great. I appreciate that feedback, Jay. And I think especially in light of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, where the millennialists are just going crazy now, saying, okay, this means Jesus is coming back, and it doesn't matter what we do to the earth, because Big Daddy in the sky is just going to come down and clean up our mess for us, and we want this all to happen. That is just such heretical theological malpractice. And but those conversations are happening. I know, because one of my students emailed me and the biblical professor at our seminary and said, my people in the Disciples of Christ Church are asking about this. What do I tell them? So we need to have those conversations. I know it's very tricky morally, ethically, but we need to decouple this situation from this apocalyptic that the signs of the apocalypse is coming. I think it's really important because it's so destructive. Other questions, observations, concerns?
The other thing that I'd like to commend is that you've given us such a good model for preparing sermons in community. So one of the things I was looking for is, how can we do this as something other than being fully clergy, biblical scholar, theologian focused? And you've really, really helped to frame that in a way that it can be a joint effort and a conversation. So thank you for that and for the tools.
Yeah, I mean, if you are in a congregation that you think that there'll be a group of people that would be willing to look at these texts and use that worksheet that I gave you, and people can have perspectives on this that might surprise you. I think about John McClure's book, The Round Table Pulpit, where he encourages pastors to meet with different groups of people a couple weeks before they're going to preach on a text and just say, what do you see? What do you hear? And then integrate that into your sermon so it becomes really a collaborative process all the way through. Elizabeth.
Thanks. I know I could just look this up, Leah, but do you have videos? Like, are you on YouTube? Can we see you preach and do what you do? Are there videos available for us so we can see you in action? And
yeah.
Thank you so much for a great evening. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. I'll send Maylan 2 links to videos. One with the one about Ruach, so you can see that video, and then one a little bit more traditional, so you can see some examples of that. I'll send that to her and then she can forward that to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time, and you've just been a fabulous group. I've really looked forward to this, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From us.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
You know,
Thank you. This
Leah.
was great. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And just a
Great.
reminder that the video of tonight will be posted on the APLM website before long, so you can share this wisdom with others. And join us for our next webinar, which will be in November. All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Leah. That was absolutely just phenomenal.
Oh, good, good.
Going to invite, in the Anglican Churches of Canada, we have the doxology